I'm recording this video in October 2023, and up to this point, if you're a cash game player looking for GTO Preflop ranges, you've been able to find plenty of 100 big blind options, and even some deep solves around the web. However, most of those deep solves cap at 200 big blinds. But what about 300? What about some actual depth? Well, today, that's what we're going to go through. I'm going to walk you through the first 300 big blind solve that's commercially available from rGTO Poker. It's in the GTO Ranges app today. And let's just do some side-by-side comparison, comparing the new 300 big blind solve to the original 100 big blinds, and see where the solver is making some different decisions with all this extra depth. Let's get into it. Good morning, how we doing today? My name is James Sweeney, aka SplitSuit, and today I want to walk through the GTO Ranges app with you and look at the new Deep 6 Max solve that we have included. This is all with 300 big blinds effective, which makes the solve a little bit different than the original 100 big blind solve that's included. Now for these ranges, these are rGTO, which means it's pure raw, it's directly out of the solver, no simplification methodology applied to it. This is just exactly what the solver would be doing based upon the game tree that we fed it, and the game tree is extremely similar to the original one that we used for the 100 big blind solve. I'll leave a link for a video down below that walks you through that in a little bit more depth if you're interested. But the side-by-side game trees are very, very similar. The one major option is that the small blind has a little bit more optionality in this one. The small blind can complete if it's folded around to them, which is different, and also the small blind can call 2 bets, which they could not do in the original 100 big blind solve. But essentially, if you're looking for the major sizing highlights, because I know a lot of people that are into GTO ranges are always interested in that part, here are the major things you need to know. The open raise size used for the solver is 2.5x. The 3-betting sizes are in position 3x, out of position 4x, and the 4-bet sizing as a default is in position 2.2x and out of position 2.8x. There are some sizing configs that can change based upon specific parameters. For instance, a complete and then a 3-bet from the small blind can be a little bit different, but this is the overall sizing strategy that the solver was given in the game tree. Alright, so with the technical stuff out of the way, I want to go through some of these ranges together with you and look at them side by side, comparing the 100 big blind solve to the 300 big blind solve. And again, because the game trees are quite similar, this will allow for a really nice research opportunity. And this is kind of one of the ways that I think about GTO ranges in the first place, because of course your opponents are not GTO robots, they're not going to be playing perfect GTO ranges themselves, pre-flop nor post-flop, so this is really a strong research opportunity and a way to get the bigger, more macro pictures out of the solver and understanding those major GTO principles as opposed to trying to just rote memorize a GTO output. That is not the way that I'd suggest thinking about GTO ranges in the first place. So to make this video a little bit easier to record, I'm going to use the private backend for the app itself. So when you actually use the app, it's going to be much prettier on your side. This is just the private backend for us being able to manage the app internally, but it's a little bit easier to visualize things side by side. So let's fire it up and get started. Alright, so right here on the left I have the original 6 max 100 big blind solve, and on the right we have the 6 max 300 big blind solve, the new deep one. So we're just going to look at them side by side, and whenever I'm given new ranges, there are a couple of preflop ranges that I check immediately. They're the first things, and it doesn't matter if someone's handing me GTO ranges, if they're handing me exploitative ranges, does not matter. These are some of the first ranges that I check every single time, and the first one is always going to be what is the under the gun open raising range that the range itself is suggesting. So in the situation of on the left, we plug in open raise for under the gun and fire that up, and on the right, same thing, under the gun open raise, fire down. There are a couple of major things that I always look at, and one is going to be the actual frequency itself. So we notice on the left 17.8% of hands are included here. In the deep it's a little bit tighter, 17.3, but roughly the same range overall. However, the next thing I look at is the actual composition. So first is frequency, second is the composition of that frequency. And there are a couple of things to note in the deep solve. So one of the first things that I noticed is the smaller pocket pairs, deuces through sixes. Notice there is a little bit of extra inclusion across the smaller ones in the deep solve versus over in the 100 big blind solve, right? 5s is 22%, but in the deep it's 26.5. Pocket 3s is 20 in the regular, but 25.5. So you are getting this roughly 20-25% bump in overall continuance from these smaller pocket pairs. Okay, nothing to super write home about. But one of the other things that I noticed very quickly is the suited King X, right? So you notice that King 8 suited, full inclusion under the gun, done in the 100 big blind solve, but only a partial inclusion and nothing of king 7 suited or king 6 suited, which makes a decent amount of sense since the reverse implied odds in the deeper solve can definitely get much more punishing. But you are also noticing a higher inclusion of things like suited connectors and even suited gappers in the deep solve compared to the 100 big blind solve over on the left, right? You have 9-8 suited being included much more often compared to 9-8 suited in the 100 big blind solve, and even things like 10-8 suited, that's getting included full jack 9 as opposed to partial jack 9 in the 100 big blind. So again, very similar frequencies, but definitely different composition, and it makes sense if you think about it for a couple minutes as to why the solver might prioritize certain combos over another. Now again, these are partial inclusions of most of these combos, but still something of note. Alright, so open raising ranges from out of the gun, again, one of the first things I check in a new solve overall, but the next one that I tend to check as a pure default is the button open raising. So it folds around to button. What does button open raise in this situation? Let's see and compare the two side by side. So we notice over in the deep, we definitely have a higher frequency, right? Roughly 47% compared to 43% in the 100 big blind solve, but composition wise, nothing too shocking. A little bit more inclusion, which of course higher frequency equals more hands included in the first place, but you're noticing, roughly half of king 7 off versus almost nothing in the 100 big blind solve. You're noticing more inclusion and getting out into wider things like suited double gappers, right? 7-4 suited, 8-5 suited is now included 100% of the time in the deep, but never in the 100 big blind. So you're just noticing a higher inclusion, and of course the suited stuff tends to get prioritized. That's very standard for preflop solves if you haven't really messed with it at all. And we're getting down to 4-3 suited, we're getting to full 5-3 suited and 6-4 suited, and again 8-5 suited as well. So nothing too shocking. And by the way, if you're looking to find the open raising ranges, they are 100% free in the app. Just make sure to download the app, redchippoker.com/app, to do so today. Get it, and also if you already have it downloaded, make sure to update it. That way you can get all of these ranges, including again all of the open raising ranges, totally for free. Or of course unlock the app and get everything, including the 3-betting ranges we're going to look at in a moment. Alright, so let's move on to the next range that I tend to check very quickly when I get a new range set. That is a hijack open raise and a button 3-bet. So we're going to plug in hijack open raises, button decides to 3-bet, do the same thing over in the deep solve on the right. Scroll everything down so we can look at the ranges together, and let's fire through. So if you're looking at this and not 100% sure what you're even looking at in the first place, this overlays the 3-bets for the button in red and the calls in blue. So you notice pocket sixes is 100% continuance, 83.5% of it is going to be a 3-bet, 16.5% is going to be a mixed call, and a couple of the things that we're looking at overall. First is the overall continuance. So again, what is the pure continuance that the solver is suggesting? And you notice it's actually quite similar, right? 14% continuance in the 100 big blind solve, deep is 13.6, so very similar in terms of the overall frequencies from everything that the button should call and also 3-bet with facing a hijack open in 6 max. But you'll notice very quickly that the density of 3-bets to calls is vastly different, right? Over in the 100 big blind, there's a lot more calling, 4.5% of hands are being called, versus, again, similar continuance in the deep, but you notice that the calling is massively degraded, and a much higher percentage of the continuance from the button in this spot is going to be a 3-bet, roughly 12.3% of hands. And to make things maybe a little bit easier to see, I'm going to turn off the calls just so we can just look at the red. Again, this is all of the 3-betting that the solver is suggesting the button do against a hijack open, and you just notice that it's kind of similar, but a lot more inclusion of things, right? So in the 100 big blind solve, pocket 9s is roughly a 51% 3-bet, but almost a 93% 3-bet in the deep. Same thing with pocket 8s, right? A lot more inclusion. Pocket 7s, a lot more inclusion, and you're noticing the same thing from really everything, right? King queen suited, king 10 suited, a lot more inclusion. Yes, it's there in the 100 big blind solve, but lots more of it in the overall shaping over in the deep solve. But a couple of things stick out to me right off the bat. First and foremost is the ace-jack offsuit. There's a slight inclusion of 3-betting in the deep versus lots more over in the 100 big blind solve, and also the smaller pocket pairs, deuces, 3s, 4s, 5s, going to get included a lot more as 3-bets as opposed to over in the 100 big blind, where you notice that if there is any inclusion with those, it's primarily getting thrown in as calls, pretty much nothing in the 3-bet, a little bit with pocket 4s, a little bit with pocket 5s, but primarily not very much, versus again in the deep solve, the solver is like, yep, let's go and 3-bet those not 100% of the time, but a decent chunk, definitely a much thicker chunk than you are in the regular 100 big blind solve. Alright, the next range I want to go through together is a little bit different. From this one, we're going to look at a button open raise and a big blind 3-bet, or really big blind continuance overall. Do the same thing over here, button open raise, big blind 3-bet, and let's just scroll it down so we can look at the ranges together. And we notice right off the bat, continuance is higher in the deep solve, not super shocking. And if we include both the calls and also the 3-bets, we can see exactly how that overlays right there. But the overall continuance, 44% of the time, the big blind should be defending against a button open raise, small blind fold. And over in the deep solve, again, roughly 48% continuance from the big blind defending against a button open with a small blind fold. So one of the first things that stands out to me when I'm looking at these ranges is the density of 3-bets to calls in the overall continuance. So you notice over in the 100 big blind solve, it's roughly a third of the overall continuance range is going to be a 3-bet, versus it's a little bit closer to a quarter of the overall defense range is going to be 3-bet in the deeper solve. That I definitely find interesting. And then if we click off the calls for a moment and we just look at the 3-bets, notice a couple of different things. First and foremost, the deep solve has a higher inclusion, or really any inclusion, of these smaller pocket pairs. Deuces through 4s are getting 3-bet roughly 36% of the time, and versus the 100 big blind solve, that's not included at all in the 3-betting range. And then I also look at things like pocket 10s, pocket 9s. Notice that's a pure 3-bet with pocket 10s in the 100 big blind solve, but in the deep solve, it's a mix between 3-betting and calling. 3-betting it roughly 77% of the time. Pocket 9s, you're noticing, yes, is a mix for both, but a much higher 3-bet in the 100 big blind solve compared to the deep solve overall. And you're noticing some extra degradation too, right? You're less 3-betting with things like ace-jack offsuit, even king-queen offsuit. I think that's definitely interesting and worth noting when you're looking at these two ranges side by side. Alright, and I want to look at one more range together, and we're just going to go through it click by click real fast, and that is a cutoff open raise, button 3-bet, cutoff continuance. Okay, so let's just pop it in real quick, and I think it's important to look at all of it kind of step by step. So the overall continuance for the cutoff open raise is, notice, pretty darn similar, 29% for the 100 big blind and roughly 29% for the 300 big blind as well. Again, a little bit of difference in terms of the prioritized hands, more deuces, more 3s, and a little bit of stuff similar to that, full inclusion of 10-7 suited versus partial inclusion in the 100 big blind solve, but overall pretty darn similar ranges. So we have that's first and foremost. Then we look at a button 3-bet, and let's go down for both of those. And again, we notice a higher 3-betting percentage overall, a decent chunk higher actually, looking at it in the deep solve compared to the 100 big blind solve. And then let's look at the cutoff continuance. Okay, so let's look at cutoff calls, let's look at cutoff calls, scroll down for both, and let's compare these for a quick moment. So since I'm interested in the overall continuance, that means the calls and also the 4-bets in this spot, I'm going to turn on calls for both. One of the first things I look at is the overall continuance. So again, looking at what hands the solver would both call with and also 4-bet with in this spot, and we notice roughly a 46% continuance in the 100 big blind solve, but we're looking at a 68% continuance in the deep solve. So again, one of the first things I look at is the overall density in the continuance. I'm looking at the comparison between the 4-bets and the call versus 3-bet in this situation. And we notice that it's a much closer density between both of those things in the 100 big blind solve versus a much higher density of calling compared to 4-betting in the deep solve, when of course out of position as the cutoff against a button 3-bet. And then if we look at just the 4-betting overall and kind of compare those, again, all the hands in red, you notice they do look a little bit different. There's lower inclusion of certain hands like pocket 9s, pocket 10s, pocket jacks. Those are a mix as well in the 100 big blind solve, but you notice a higher density of 4-betting with those hands as opposed to in the deep solve, there's a higher density of calling happening with quite a few of those. But then one of the things I find most interesting is actually up in the strong double Broadway hands. You notice that there's a lot of 4-betting going on with ace king offsuit, ace queen offsuit, and none of ace queen suited or ace jack suited, versus in the deep solve you notice there's a lot more flatting going on with ace king offsuit, pure flats going on with ace queen off, right? If we click that in, of course that's going to be 100% continuance, it's just all calls according to the solver. And you notice that there is a lot of inclusion of ace queen suited, ace jack suited, where there is no 4-betting happening with that in the 100 big blind solve. But again, the whole point of this is not to just mindlessly copy the solver. It's to understand the bigger pictures from the solver, how things look at 100 big blind depth versus much deeper depth, and then thinking about how you can actually take those macro patterns and apply them into your own game, into your own strategy, into your own range formulation and continuance frequencies at the table. But even though this kind of work and exploration definitely takes some time, at the end of the day it can be extremely helpful. If you're interested again in doing your own kind of work, not just on the ranges we talked about in this video, but many of the other ones, everything from 3-betting and 4-betting and even 5-betting, you can unlock the entire range today, again at redchippoker.com/app, or just look for the GTO Ranges app in your app store of choice. But either way, thank you so much for hanging out today. Hopefully you enjoyed, hopefully you learned a little something. Again, this is my overall methodology whenever I'm given new ranges. Look at those overall continuance frequencies, look at the overall range construction and how those frequencies are being built by the solver. I think that's going to be extremely helpful if you've never done this kind of work before. Even if you're just looking at things side by side, two different ranges altogether, this is still the way that I would suggest going through it, exploring it, and trying to understand again the big picture takeaways from a range, especially ranges from a solver. Your opponents are not GTO perfect, so as such getting the pictures and the big picture patterns is going to be much more valuable. So if you're still watching at this point, hopefully you enjoyed. A thumbs up on the video would be massively appreciated, and I'll see you back shortly with a brand new video. In the meantime, good luck out there and happy grinding.